All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive on a thinker who really kind of turned upside down the way a lot of people think about philosophy in the 20th century, and that's Donald Davidson. We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy entry as our guide. So Davidson's work, it's a little bit challenging, but I think you're really going to get a lot out of it.
Absolutely. He really offers, I think, a perspective on some of the biggest questions in philosophy that you just don't find anywhere else.
So who was Donald Davidson?
Well, let's start with just a little biographical sketch. Davidson was born in 1917 and he died in 2003. And his journey is fascinating because he started with a real deep interest in literature and classics, but later he transitioned to a more analytical approach to philosophy under the influence of his teacher, W.V.O. Quine.
So it sounds like he's got this very diverse background. Did his early interests kind of influence his later work at all?
Absolutely. It's not that he completely abandoned his love for literature. In fact, I think quite the opposite. He actually kind of merged those ways of thinking into his philosophical work. So he saw these connections between the creativity, the human element of literature, and the rigor of analytical philosophy.
So instead of being these two separate fields, he kind of found this way to bridge them together. I love that. So what are some of the big groundbreaking ideas that he came up with?
Well, one of the most central ones, and really one that had the biggest impact, I would say, in philosophy, was his thinking about actions and reasons and causes. So back in the day, many philosophers thought that reasons and causes were just totally separate things.
Okay, so it's like you do something because of a physical cause, like a reflex or something, or you do it because you have a reason for doing it. You want to achieve some goal.
Right, exactly. But Davidson, he said, no, 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 that's not right at all. He argued that explaining an action in terms of reasons is a kind of causal explanation.
Wait, hold on. Can you explain that a little bit more? I'm not sure I'm totally following.
Sure. So think of it this way. You decide to go for a run. Now, the reason you go for a run, maybe you want to exercise, maybe you want to clear your head. That reason is what causes you to actually put on your shoes and go outside and go for a run. Your reasons aren't just floating around in your mind. They're actually directly connected to your actions.
Ah, so it's not an either or. It's our reasons for doing things are actually a type of cause?
Precisely. So he's arguing that our mental states, like our beliefs and desires, they are connected to the physical world, and they actually have real world effects.
Okay, so that's a pretty big departure from the way that people traditionally viewed the mind and body.
It is, and it actually leads into another one of Davidson's really big ideas, which is something that he called the anomalism of the mental.
Okay, that sounds a little scary. What does that mean?
It's not as intimidating as it sounds, I promise. So Davidson has three main principles here. First of all, he says that mental events, things like our thoughts and feelings, they definitely interact with physical events.
Right, I mean, if I'm feeling sad, I might physically cry or something like that.
Exactly, they're connected. Now, the second principle is that cause and effect relationships, they rely on strict laws, like the laws of physics. So we can explain events by showing how they fit into these laws.
Okay, I'm with you so far, but where does the anomalism part come in?
Well, that's the third principle. Davidson says that there are no strict laws that can directly connect the mental and physical realms.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying that our minds can cause things to happen in the physical world, but there's no actual law governing how that happens. How's that possible?
Yeah, it seems like a real paradox, right? But Davidson, he's got a solution. He says that mental events, they're what he calls supervenient on physical events, meaning that mental events, they depend on physical events, but you can't reduce them down to simple physical laws.
Okay, can you give me an example of what you mean by supervenient?
Sure, so imagine listening to a piece of music, a really complex piece of music. Now, the experience that you have listening to that music, the emotions that it evokes, the memories that it brings up, that's a mental event, right? But that mental event, it depends on a physical event, which is the sound waves vibrating in the air, hitting your eardrums. But you can't fully explain the experience of music just by talking about sound waves.
So you're saying that the mental experience, it relies on the physical event, but it's also something more than just that.
Exactly. There's this added layer of complexity, of meaning. And Davidson suggests that mental events are tied to physical ones, but not in a way that we can neatly capture with scientific laws.
So this is a really nuanced view of the mind-body relationship.
It is.
And I'm assuming that this idea of supervenience kind of plays a role in his other ideas as well.
Absolutely. It's really a foundation for his later work on meaning and how we understand each other, but that's a discussion for another time.
All right, so it sounds like we're just getting started. We'll be back soon to explore how Davidson's ideas about the mind lead to a truly revolutionary approach to language and meaning. So last time we were really wrestling with Davidson's idea of the anomalism of the mental, this idea that mental events, they're connected to physical events, but they can't be reduced to those simple physical laws.
Right, and this actually lays the groundwork for how Davidson approaches this really, really tough problem of meaning. How is it that we make sense of words in communication?
Yeah, because on the surface, it seems like it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it does, but Davidson wants to go deeper than our everyday understanding? Imagine, like, trying to talk to someone who speaks a totally different language, like a language you've never even encountered before. You don't have any dictionaries, no translators. How do you even begin to understand what they're saying?
Yeah, that sounds pretty impossible. Where do you even start?
This is where Davidson's approach gets really, really interesting. So instead of getting bogged down in trying to define meaning directly, he shifts the focus to the concept of truth. He asks, under what conditions would a speaker hold this sentence to be true?
So instead of asking, what does this word mean? We're asking, when would a speaker say, yep, that's a true statement? Okay, I think I'm starting to follow you a little bit, but how do we actually figure out what those conditions are?
Well, this is where another philosopher's work comes into play, and that's Alfred Tarski. He developed a theory of truth that is very influential for Davidson.
Okay, so now we're adding another layer to this puzzle.
Yeah, in a way we are, but Tarski's theory gives us this framework for understanding how we can define truth in a language. The details are pretty complex, but the basic idea is that we can pair up sentences from the language that we're trying to understand with sentences from our own language.
Okay, so instead of trying to translate the words directly, we're trying to find those situations where a speaker would say, yep, that's true. And then from there, we can start to map out the connections between their language and our own.
Exactly. It's like building a bridge between two languages by focusing on those shared truths rather than getting lost in the words themselves. And this avoids a lot of the really tricky philosophical problems that come up when you try to define meaning directly.
So it's kind of a more practical, grounded way to approach this problem. But I'm curious, how does this actually work when we're trying to understand someone who's speaking a completely foreign language? I mean, it's not like we're carrying around a Tarski dictionary or something like that.
Right, and this is where Davidson takes Tarski's theory and he applies it to his own concept of radical interpretation. And that's the idea that we can, in principle, understand someone's language from scratch just by observing their behavior and the world around them.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but it's about how those words connect to the speaker's actions and their environment.
Exactly. And Davidson really emphasizes this. We need to consider everything, their actions, their reactions, their gestures, their tone of voice, everything. It's like being a detective. You're piecing together clues to figure out what's going on in their mind. What are they trying to communicate?
So this goes back to his ideas about actions, reasons, and causes. It's about trying to understand the whole person, not just their words.
Absolutely, you got it. And this is where the principle of charity comes in, and that's a really key part of Davidson's approach to radical interpretation.
Okay, another principle. What does charity have to do with understanding a foreign language?
Well, it's not about being polite or anything like that. It's more about assuming that the person we're trying to understand is basically rational. We assume that their beliefs are largely true, that they're not just speaking nonsense.
So we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, assuming that they're trying to make sense, that their words have some connection to reality.
Exactly. And this isn't just being nice. It's actually a necessary assumption if we're going to understand them at all. If we assume that they're totally irrational, there's no way to make sense of what they're saying or doing.
So can you give me an example of how this works in practice?
Sure, imagine you're observing a speaker of this new language. You're watching their behavior. You're trying to figure out, what are the patterns here? And then they point to a furry creature hopping by and they say, Gavagai.
Gavagai. Okay, what do we do?
We apply the principle of charity. We assume that they're trying to communicate something meaningful. And we see a rabbit, so we might guess that Gavagai means rabbit.
So we're combining our knowledge of the world with the speaker's behavior to make a guess about what they mean.
Right now, we could be wrong. Maybe Gavagai means, look, a furry thing, or I'm hungry, or who knows. But the point is, we got to start somewhere, and the principle of charity gives us a starting point.
So it's kind of like this guiding principle that helps us narrow down the possibilities and make reasonable interpretations.
That's a great way to put it. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds incredibly complex. Do we really do all of this radical interpretation every time we talk to someone?
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of mental gymnastics just to have a conversation.
Well, of course, we don't go through all these steps consciously every time we talk to someone. But Davidson's point is that these principles, they're operating in the background. They're underlying our ability to communicate and understand each other.
So it's like the underlying operating system of our language abilities.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And what's even more fascinating is that Davidson doesn't just limit this to understanding other people. He thinks it plays a crucial role in understanding ourselves as well.
Wait, how does understanding someone else's language help us understand ourselves?
Well, think about it. When we're trying to interpret what someone else is saying, we're constantly comparing their beliefs to our own beliefs. We're trying to see, where do we agree, where do we disagree, and why?
So you're saying that in trying to understand someone else, we actually learn more about ourselves in the process.
Exactly. It's like holding up a mirror to our own minds. By engaging in this process of interpretation, we become wide aware of our own beliefs, our own values, our own way of seeing the world.
So understanding others and understanding ourselves, they're deeply interconnected.
Exactly. And Davidson's philosophy, it just emphasizes these connections over and over again. Connections between our minds and the world, connections between ourselves and others. And by exploring these connections, I think we gain a much deeper understanding of what it means to be human.
Yeah, this is definitely giving me a lot to think about, but it seems like we've only just scratched the surface of Davidson's ideas.
Oh, definitely. There's so much more to explore. In our next segment, we're going to delve into Davidson's concept of triangulation, which really brings together a lot of these ideas in a really thought-provoking way.
All right, get ready. We're going to unravel this concept of triangulation and see what insights it offers into knowledge, meaning, and the mind. Okay, so we're back, and we're ready to tackle, I think, one of Davidson's most interesting but also challenging concepts, triangulation.
Right. Yeah, this is where things get it's a really powerful idea, but it takes a little effort to wrap your head around it.
Yeah, I mean, when I hear triangulation, I think of like maps and compasses and maybe getting lost in the woods.
Well, you're not totally off base there. Davidson uses triangulation as a metaphor for how we actually come to know anything. So think about it. If you're trying to figure out where you are on a map, you need at least two other points of reference to triangulate your position, right?
Right, you need those other points to kind of get your bearings and figure out, okay, where am I in relation to everything else?
Exactly. And Davidson's argument is that it's the same with knowledge. To really understand anything, whether it's ourselves, other people, or the world around us, we need 3 points of reference. We need knowledge of ourselves, knowledge of others, and knowledge of the world.
So it's not like we start with just knowing ourselves and then build out from there.
No, Davidson actually challenges that traditional view. He says that our understanding of all three of these things is totally intertwined. We can't have one without the others.
Okay, so can you give me an example of how this triangulation thing actually works in practice?
Sure. So let's imagine a little kid, they're learning the word red for the first time. So they see a red ball, and their parent points at it and says red.
Okay.
Now, for that kid to actually understand what red means, there's a lot going on there.
Okay, what's happening?
Well, first, the kid needs to understand that the parent is actually trying to teach them something, right? They're not just like making random sounds. That's knowledge of others right there.
Okay.
Second, they need to be able to connect that word red with the actual red ball that they're seeing, right? That's knowledge of the world.
Okay, I got it. So what's the third point?
The third point is the kid's own awareness of themselves as the one who's having this experience. They're the one learning this new word, and that's knowledge of self. So all three of those elements are working together at the same time to make meaning possible.
It's amazing. Something as simple as learning a word like red involves this whole intricate relationship between you know yourself, other people, and the world around you.
Absolutely. And this concept of triangulation, it has some really big implications for how we think about knowledge and truth in general.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it challenges this idea that our thoughts are somehow private, like locked away in our heads, separate from the world. Davidson suggests that our minds are actually connected to the world and to other minds in a really fundamental way.
So we're not just these isolated brains floating around.
Right. Davidson's view really undermines a lot of those classic philosophical pictures of the mind as this solitary, self-contained thing. We can't really have knowledge or understanding without those connections.
So it seems like this has implications for things like skepticism too, right? The idea that we can't really know anything for sure.
Definitely. In fact, Davidson argues that if knowledge really is triangulated like he says it is, then skepticism actually becomes self-defeating.
Wait, really? How does that work?
Well, if you're a skeptic, you're saying, I don't really know anything for sure. But to even make that claim, you have to rely on some knowledge, right? You have to have knowledge of yourself as a skeptic. You have to have knowledge of other skeptical philosophers. You have to know what the arguments for skepticism are. It's a kind of contradiction.
So skepticism kind of undermines itself because it relies on the very thing that it's saying we can't have.
Exactly. And it also raises problems for relativism, too. This idea that truth is relative to each individual or to each culture. If all truth is relative, then how can we even understand each other? How can we disagree with each other in a way that makes sense? Triangulation shows us that communication and understanding really depend on some shared world, some shared set of assumptions about what's rational or what's not.
So Davidson's basically pushing back against both skepticism and relativism
Yeah.
by showing that we need some common ground, some shared points of reference if we want to have any hope of knowing anything or understanding each other.
Exactly. And he does this by really emphasizing how interconnected our minds are to the world and to each other. It's a really powerful, groundbreaking way of looking at knowledge and meaning and what it means to be human.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. Davidson, he's not an easy thinker, that's for sure, but his ideas are so rich and rewarding.
Totally agree. And if anyone out there is interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Davidson.
Yeah, there's a whole world of ideas there, just waiting to be explored.
Absolutely.
And who knows, maybe in the process of understanding Davidson, we might even learn a little bit more about ourselves along the way, too.
That's the best part.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of Donald Davidson. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep those conversations flowing.